For the past 25 years, independent investigator and author Lisa Pease has been researching and writing about the assassination of President Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Robert Kennedy. In her most recent book, A Lie Too Big to Fail, The Real History of the Assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, Ms. Pease argues the evidence in the case points away from the convicted assassin, Sirhan Sirhan, and toward the CIA. Next, she discusses her findings in remarks she made at a conference on political assassinations of the 1960s, hosted by the JFK Historical Group.
Okay, well, let's get started. Thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate your interest in what I call the real history, because we're all fed a bunch of stories that may have seemed true at the time by the people who were telling them. But as time goes by, we get more information and more inputs, and stories evolve and change. History is like a river. It's constantly flowing, and there's new inputs at every point. So whenever we think we know the entire answer, then new data comes in, and we have to shift our thinking. I've been looking into this case for about 25 years, as I will tell you as the slides go on. So let's go to the next slide here. Okay. First of all, again, this is history, and people always say, why should I care? It's history. And so I say, well, why do you punish your children when they do something wrong? So they learn not to do it again, right? That's why we have to get history right. We have to punish the perpetrators posthumously if that's our only option, so that it doesn't happen again. Had we found and punished the perpetrators of the John Kennedy assassination, we might never have lost Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy. We might have had all of them. Can you imagine a presidency with Robert Kennedy, with Martin Luther King as his vice president? I mean, what a world we lost in the 60s. You know, they were taken out. I don't want to lose the next person who speaks out against war, against inequality, and in favor of fairness. And that's why I've been studying this for so very long. All right. And history isn't about the past. History, to me, is very much about the present moment and what I live and what I understand. Because of my research, I see different things in the news than other people notice. Today, there was a story in the Washington Post by the same reporter, Tom Jackman, who wrote a wonderful article on my piece, and he talks about an assassination that's in my book, the Galindez assassination. There was a Columbia University professor who was killed, and it was a bit of a mystery who killed him, but there's a lot of evidence that a man named Robert Mayhew, who was a CIA cutout, who worked for the Howard Hughes organization, may have organized the plot against Galindez. And the interesting thing is that the guy who is FOIAing, trying to get the records for the Galindez case, if he gets the records, it sets a precedent that will release the Mueller investigation files. So there you have it, right there, the connection from the past to the present. Everything is connected. Everything in history has a precedent and something that comes from it. All right.
Lisa, could you move your mic just a little closer? I think some people are having trouble with that.
Let me see. No worries. Is that better?
Yes.
Oh, there you go. Okay, thank you. Okay, so why am I here? Well, I didn't want to write a book. And people don't believe that. Like, of course you want to write a book. I'm like, no, I really did not want to write a book. If you've ever written a book, it is so much work. I work full time. I work, in a typical business job, and when I get home, I'm tired. So I found the only way to get this done was to work my lunch hour and my weekends. So I've had no life for about the last 4 years, and I'm really eager to have a life again. But my own curiosity led me to this. When the internet first went public, my very first search ever was JFK assassination. And the JFK case got me into this news group where I started arguing with people, and at that point, I'd read 2 books. And so I thought I was an expert. I read 2 books. I know everything about this. No, I didn't. I didn't know anything. And people reminded me of that daily, hourly, minute by minute. As those of you who've been in online forums understand, it's like, you're being shot at the whole time. But it was great. It was a great experience because it really developed my own personal fortitude. It's like, I don't care what insults you sling at me. I've probably heard it 5 times already. I'm ready to go. But in the course of my JFK assassination research, one day at the public library in downtown Los Angeles, I pulled out the wrong drawer. It was right next to the one I should have been pulling out. And there were all these microfilm reels from the Los Angeles Police Department's investigation of the Robert Kennedy files. And it was 1992, and I knew that the files had only been released in 1988. And I'm like, wow, they've only been out for 4 years. I bet you I'll find something on them that no one else has found. Well, years later, I found a lot of stuff that no one else has found, because I've been literally reading the files ever since. I started on microfilm when the files were ultimately digitized and put online. I, continued reading there. But I was fascinated by the original records more than other people's book accounts. I really wanted to see for myself how it unfolded. All right, and the facts that I was finding did not match the official story. In fact, the very first reel that I put in the first set of files were some witnesses talking about a second guy apprehended at the hotel that night. And I'm like, what? There was somebody else besides Sirhan? And they're like, yeah, this guy was handcuffed and taken out. I'm like, well, who was that? And his name was Michael Wayne. And it turns out Michael Wayne is a very, very, very interesting character. I don't think he was a shooter, but I think he was definitely involved. And I have a big section on my book on him. And believe me, in the hour that I have, I cannot possibly cover everything that is in my book. So I'm trying to take very small, discrete, and hopefully provable pieces for you tonight. But I do encourage you, please read the whole book. There's no way this is a summary of what is in my book. It's not even close. Okay, so what I found is that facts can lie. What? Yes, facts can lie. How can facts lie? Let me give you an example. All right, in 2017, so again, recent, just a couple years ago, 2 women assassinated Kim Jong-nam, the half-brother to the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, in an airport. And what happened is one woman went up and sprayed water in his face, which kind of caught him off guard. The other woman rushed up behind him and toweled him off, except the towel had a VX nerve agent on it. And he died a few hours later in a hospital. Now, both women thought they were participating in a TV stunt and had done this to others with no previous effect. And the one who used the towel showed up the next day for the next stunt, ready to go. How guilty are they? Did they commit murder? Or were they tricked into participating in an assassination plot without their knowledge? This is incredibly relevant to the Sirhan case, because my argument is Sirhan was tricked into participating in a plot without his understanding or knowledge. And I will try to make the case today. I will probably not succeed because of, how much can you say in an hour that can make such an important proof possible. All right, but new facts can completely change any story. Context is everything. This anecdote is directly relevant to the Sirhan case. Okay, facts change over time. Things that were established fact in the past are not necessarily facts anymore. Pluto used to be a planet. All my life, Pluto was a planet. Until 2006, suddenly it got demoted. It's not a planet now. It's a dwarf planet. Its angle is wrong. It's not part of our, solar system anymore. It's like, how did that happen? And I think we get emotionally, I know I did. I was like emotionally attached to Pluto being a planet. And I was very resistant to the fact that it was no longer part of the solar system. That felt so unfair to me. And I think we're all emotionally attached to facts, some that matter more than Pluto. And it's hard to let go and take in the new information. So try to do that today. All right, and of course the Brontosaurus, similar story. When I was a kid, I loved the Brontosaurus. It was my favorite dinosaur. In the 80s, it got demoted. It wasn't a dinosaur anymore. It was really just another variant of a different species. But in 2015, it got reinstated. They found enough genetic differences, it got to be a Brontosaurus again. I was very excited to find that today when I was writing my speech. Anyway, so new facts change our understanding of history, and that's why history is never really settled. And we can't say, oh, we know everything about that case. It's constantly evolving. Everything is constantly in motion. All right, the killing of Robert F. Kennedy ended an era in this country. Killing the top 4 leaders of the anti-war movement removed hope and put us on a trajectory of despair. People tuned in, turned on, and dropped out, just as the CIA-friendly Timothy O'Leary suggested they do. The Vietnam War took many more lives than it would have if these leaders had been allowed to live. Was that why they were killed? I don't know for sure. I strongly suspect it. I believe that. Can I prove it? That's a different thing. So at some point, we have to act on what we believe, what we think we know, because there are some answers we will never concretely get to the point where you could take it to court and hang somebody on it. But it makes sense. It explains so much of what followed. Now, why did I title my book, A Lie Too Big to Fail? Well, as I was writing it, of course, the financial crisis had hit and we were all struggling with that. And we saw what happened when a bank or a business was too big to fail. The government rushed in and propped it up. And that is exactly what's been happening in the Robert Kennedy assassination story ever since. All right, once they started with one lie that was really too big to fail, they have told incredible lies, some really hilarious lies, in fact, to try and prop this story up. So what is the lie that's too big to fail? The lie is several parts. That Sirhan Sirhan alone killed Senator Robert Kennedy and shot 5 others in the pantry. There's kind of 4 lies in that. All right, because in fact, Sirhan shot no bullets in the pantry. And that's going to be the most controversial thing I mentioned today. And there are other researchers who completely disagree with me on this point, to which I say, show me the evidence he did fire bullets. Because guess what? It's not in the record. There is literally no physical evidence linking his gun to any of the victim bullets, to any of the bullets in Robert Kennedy. There is instead strong evidence he was firing blanks. And this is kind of like Pluto getting demoted. That's hard for people to come to. They're kind of emotionally attached to Sirhan being the obvious person who was a key part of the conspiracy. If there was a conspiracy, he was clearly a key participant. How could he possibly not have been firing bullets? We'll see a little bit more about that as we go along. Sirhan was absolutely not alone. That's another thing. We've been told over and over, every time this story is, Sirhan, the lone gunman, killed this. And that's just not true. I'll show you some statements and some names of people who were suspects. All right, and Sirhan had no idea what he's involved in. That's probably the hardest pill for people to swallow. How could he possibly be there standing, firing a gun? Because there's no question that he was standing there firing a gun. But what was he firing? And did he know what he was doing? This is what we have to determine. Okay, and then people go on, but, Sirhan confessed in court, and again to David Frost on TV. Well, guess what? That outburst in court, he claimed, I planned to kill Kennedy with malice aforethought, since I was 4 years old, basically, is the way, with 20 years malice aforethought, which would have made him 4. Obviously, that was ridiculous. At that point, Sirhan had been begging the judge. That originally transpired in chambers with the judge because he was trying to get new lawyers because he didn't like the fact they were trying to paint him as mentally ill, even though the lawyers thought that was the best way to save his life. And so he just erupted. And then that became his confession and was repeated all over the press, even though it was not meant as a confession in that way. And his David Frost interview given years later, his brother Munir told me, he said, Lisa, that was entirely scripted. His lawyer told him everything. The questions were scripted and the answers were scripted. And he was told that if he said everything they asked him to say, he would have a better chance of getting paroled. And by then, the guy had been in jail for several years, like 20 years or so, almost. And so he wanted to get out of jail. He trusted his lawyers, as most people would, right? Your lawyer says you got to do this, they do it. But it wasn't the truth. And people need to understand that, because I know a lot of people under the hood were writing Tom Jackman after his article came out in the Washington Post about my book and saying, oh, but you got to see the David Frost interview. But that interview is staged, it's not true, and it's not what happened. Okay. And in fact, Sirhan had no memory of what had happened. And again, how is that possible? How is that possible that you can't remember the crime? It sounds like such a convenient excuse. Except even the police and the assistant DA who questioned him right after the shooting knew there was something terribly wrong. This is right out of the transcript. It's a little portion from a page in my book, but it's right out of the transcript. Howard here is Assistant DA John Howard for the County of Los Angeles. So the suspect, who had ostensibly just killed the second Kennedy with presidential aspirations in 5 years, was calmly discussing the philosophy of justice while he's supposedly being questioned. Something about all of this prompted Howard to switch gears and ask a very different question of the suspect. You know where we are? I've told you you've been booked. I don't know, the suspect responded, justifying Howard's question. You're in custody. You've been booked. You understand what I've been? The suspect interrupted with something unintelligible, followed by, I have been before a magistrate, have I not? And he goes, no, you have not. You will be taken before a magistrate as soon as possible, probably will be tried. You're downtown Los Angeles in the central jail. This is the main jail for the LA Police Department. You'll be booked into a cell. Do you understand where you are? as long as you say it, was the suspect's strange response. There's something not right there, all right? And there's strong, strong, strong evidence that Sirhan was in a hypnotic state when he was in the pantry. I'll only be able to touch on that today. Again, I encourage you to read the book. I'll talk a little bit about the power of hypnosis because I actually got to witness something personally that really freaked me out and kind of scared me. Don't ever let yourself be hypnotized. When I tell you the anecdote, you'll understand why. All right, but even the DA knew something was wrong right off the bat. Okay. But, extraordinary claims deserve extraordinary evidence. You know, you just gave us a few slides. That doesn't prove anything. And I can't prove it all in an hour. If I could, I wouldn't have written the book. Trust me, I would not have written the book. But I have sourced the evidence for every assertion I make in some 800 footnotes. And I very kindly put them right on the same page so you don't have to flip to the back to see what my source is. I hate doing that in other people's books, so tried to save you some time. And what sources did I use? Well, I went through some of the audio tapes of the original witness statements. A lot of them had not been transcribed. And I found as I went through them, it was usually the ones that hadn't been transcribed that had something really interesting on them. And that's why they hadn't been transcribed. So I had to listen to a lot of stuff, you know, over and over, because some of them were recorded at very low volume. The police took these suitcases out, and the recorder was hidden inside the suitcase, like a briefcase, basically. And so they would like set that down under the table while they were talking. It was being recorded, but people didn't even know they were being recorded. So that's why sometimes the volume is very low and it's hard to read. You're like playing it over and over. So I did that for you so that you don't have to. All right, photographs and videos from the scene, official government documents. Of course, those LAPD records I found on microfilm were probably the bulk of what I went through. It was just fascinating. I couldn't stop reading it. The FBI records, which were also available on microfilm, CIA files, often from its own website. When I got into the hypnosis aspect, the CIA, as many of you know, had mind control programs that the Church Committee and others investigated. There was actually a whole Senate hearing on MKULTRA that Ted Kennedy, of all people, led. I think he had a personal interest in that subject for obvious reasons. There's just incredible things in those files, some of which are in books and some of which haven't been until my book, and I'm sure there's much more that I haven't found. So that's really a rich vein to be mined. And of course, the Church Committee, the Pike Committee, the Watergate Committee, there was stuff relevant to this assassination and stuff in my book from all of these investigations. I also tracked down some witnesses. I didn't interview the ones who had been interviewed a lot, like Sandy Serrano. She's been interviewed like 6 times. And I feel like she's told us everything she has to say. I was very interested in 13-year-old Ronald Panda, you know, who was like a little kid at the time, and I tracked him down in Oregon, and he was very hesitant to talk to me, and a lot of people I found were very scared because the police had gone out to them and said, here, there's a judge's order saying you can't talk to reporters or anybody but the court about the case. And the thing is, that was only true until the trial was over, but the way it was presented to them, it sounded like forever. And so it's been hard for me to get people to talk to me. I often have to talk to them 5 or 6 times before they'll actually sit down and open up with me. So again, I've saved you some time. I've done a lot of that, and it's in my book. All right, of course, press reports and books by others were valuable as well. All right, here are the facts that are not in dispute by anyone. This is what we know for sure that everybody agrees. First of all, the assassination was kind of a 3-day event. June 4th was a Tuesday. That was the California presidential primary. June 5th, right after midnight, after Kennedy finishes his speech, he's shot in the pantry right next to the stage. As he leaves the stage area, he's shot, and then he died a little more than 25 hours later on June 6th. So you might see the date of the assassination as any one of these 3 dates because it's a little tricky getting it exactly right. Shot on the 5th, died on the 6th. Okay. So shortly after midnight, what happened? Well, RFK left the stage, took a right turn, entered a kitchen pantry. And boy, I wish I could show this to you. All right, if I am pantry doors, if I'm like 2 doors here, Kennedy comes in this one. All right, and then as he's walking forward, he talks to the people along the way. Busboys are shaking his hand. At one point, he turns this way, all right, shakes a hand, and then he's about to continue forward, and a young man steps out, pulls a gun, and fires directly at him from in front of him, and that would be Sirhan. And we know he was in front of him. Well, you'll see that in a minute. We'll come to that. Okay, but RFK was mortally wounded. Sirhan's identity was not known at the time. It took them several hours. They tried tracing the gun, and then when his picture was shown on TV in the morning, one of his brothers recognized him and said, "Oh my God, I think that's our brother, and he didn't come home last night. Let's go see if that's him." And so can you imagine waking up to see that on TV? And of course, Sirhan claimed to have no memory of the shooting. So these are the things, you know, that we agree happened, whether you believe them or not, that's what happened. All right, now the official shot count, according to the LAPD, Kennedy was shot 4 times. He was shot once behind the right ear at a distance of about 1.5 inches or so, according to the coroner. His book actually says 3 inches, but the coroner himself says 1.5, and the book has other errors, so I think his co-writer might have made that slip up. Okay, Kennedy, one of the bullets went only through the clothing. 3 of the bullets entered from under the arm. 1 lodged at the back of his neck, 1 came out through his chest, and again, 1 kind of went right through the clothes without entering his body. And then 5 other people in the pantry had bullets removed from them. All right, there were also 3 bullet holes in the ceiling. So the police decided, well, one of the bullets went up into the ceiling, hit the upper ceiling, bounced back down, and then ricocheted into one of the victims because they were out of bullets at that point. So we really have 12 points of entry in the official story. This isn't even counting the other bullets in the room. But in the official story, there are 12 points of entry for a gun that can only hold 8 bullets. So a little bit of a problem right off the bat. Okay, and then all the shots that hit Kennedy came from behind. And again, I just talked about where they went, so I'm going to skip right past that. Okay, and let's talk about Sirhan's position here. All right, Sirhan was in front of Kennedy and facing him. Now we know this because a lot of witnesses saw only Sirhan or only Kennedy. So I ignored all of those people. I looked only at the witnesses who saw them both at the same time during the shooting. And that narrowed it down to about 4 people. And they all said the same thing. The gun muzzle was about 3 feet from Kennedy. All right, but again, the medical evidence is 3 inches at most and more likely 1.5 inches. So again, serious problem with the evidence. Also, there are people who've tried to say, well, Kennedy, you know, maybe he was facing Kennedy, but he turned right at the last minute. Well, that's not what any witness saw. And Kennedy himself is kind of our best witnesses because he threw up his hands in front of his face. So he knew the threat was coming from the front. You don't do that if you're being shot from behind. You go, ow, you know. But he went like this because he perceived the threat from the front. That's instinctive. So we know that's where Sirhan was. All right, all the witnesses who saw Kennedy and Sirhan clearly at the same time, again, put the distance from the gun muzzle at 3 feet. I just said where he was shot from. So let's get now to some of the big lies we were told about this case. All right, so in addition to the fact that Sirhan couldn't possibly have shot Robert Kennedy, there are more lies, believe it or not. There are many more. No one heard more than 8 gunshots. That's what we've been told, and that's just not true. You know, Booker Griffin heard 10 to 12 shots. Suzanne Locke heard a total of 8 or 10 shots. Jesse Unruh heard between 5 and 10 sharp shots. Estelyn Duffy heard at least about 10 shots. All right, and so on and so on. And there are many more. On these slides, I'm not at all capturing all the statements. There are many more, and there's many more that are not in my book because at some point it's like overkill. So, but believe me, there are many more. All right, similarly, another lie, that there was no physical evidence of extra bullets. Well, that's just not true. The FBI photographed, remember those door frames, and Kennedy walked through this side, this door was closed. All right, but in the center door frame, there were 2 bullet holes, like about here. And in this side of the door frame, from your perspective, there were also 2 bullet holes on an angle. I'd have to rotate my mind to figure out which way it was angled. I think this way, from your point of view. Okay, so there are 4 more bullet holes than the gun could hold. Because remember, 7 bullets removed from victims, and 1 was evidently lost in the ceiling space since it had 3 holes. 1 had to go up there and stay there. All right, so again, we have 4 extra bullets. Now we're up to 12 bullets from 1 8-shot gun. Not possible, right? There's also a 13th shot, because if through these doors, if you go through this door, there's a little uphill ramp to the stage door that Kennedy had walked out of after he finished his speech. He walked out the stage door, turned right and head to the pantry. There was a bullet lodged in the wood in that door frame. And it is kind of in line. If somebody is shooting in the pantry towards Kennedy, it could easily have gone right into the bottom of that since it was elevated a little bit. And that was in the AP. There was a photo with 2 cops pointing at it and said, "The bullet is still in the hole," was the caption. All right, so now we're up to 13 bullets. And in my book, I actually get you up to 16 for sure, you know, and maybe 17. It's shocking. There were a lot of bullets. And that's discounting, because there was one guy who said, oh, there were a lot of bullets in the walls. We took the bullets out of the walls. And if we took even one bullet out of the wall, that's shocking. But if we took more than one, it's a big number. So clearly there were multiple people firing. Okay, so again, next slide. There were no other shooters. There had to be other shooters to account for that many bullets. It's just impossible. And witnesses saw other shooters or other guns. In this slide, I talk about the guns. Witnesses saw at least 2 different people running guns out of the pantry while Sirhan was being tackled. One saw it like under some sort of a reporter's notebook or a piece of paper. He wasn't sure what was covering it, but he said there was a gun underneath whatever he was covering it with. Somebody else had a similar story, but it's clear one guy was short, one was tall, one was blonde, one was dark-haired. They weren't the same guy, but 2 different people running a gun out. One witness and another witness was adamant in every interview, and he was interviewed several times, that he saw the security guard who was directly at Kennedy's right. So again, if I'm Kennedy, there was a security guard holding this elbow. In fact, could I get a volunteer? Would you come up on the stage for a second here? Come this way. You'll be the guard. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we need more women on TV anyway. There you go. That's all right. I'm going to switch places with you here. Okay, so I'm Robert Kennedy. You're going to be the security guard. You're going to grab my elbow with whatever hand you would grab it with. If you were leading me forward, how would you do that? Yeah, that hand. Exactly. Are you right-handed?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Now imagine you have a gun in that hand. Okay. Now Kennedy was shot 3 times under his arm, you know, under his armpit. Who's in a better position to do it? And this is a big, burly guy. I know she doesn't look big or burly, but it was a big, burly guy. He could kind of hide it, you know what I mean? He could do it. He could just kind of, you know, get right in there. But that would only account for 3 shots. If you tried to shoot me in the head, look how exposed her arm is. Now a lot more people would see it, right? If it's down there, it's under the arm, it's subtle, she can get away with it. If she puts her hand up here, people are going to see it. Thank you so much. But again, Kennedy was shot 3 times under the arm, but he was shot by a different kind of bullet in the head. That's the other thing. The bullets that went through his body didn't explode and fragment, but the one that was shot in his head did. So I've always thought that was weird. It's like, how come that one exploded, but the other ones didn't? And as I researched, it looked like there's actually yet another shooter who manages to sneak out in next to Kennedy's head. And I'm going to leave the details of that to my book because it's a long ways getting to that point, and I don't have the time for that. But there was a couple of very credible witnesses who thought a guy in a white busboy uniform shot Kennedy in the head at close range. And Sirhan was not wearing a white busboy uniform. He was wearing a blue velour shirt with a zipper and blue jeans and did not look like a waiter. He was disheveled, you know, hair a mess, and so on. Not the same person. All right, so another lie. There were no other suspects. Well, actually, on police radio right after the shooting, there were 6 different suspects. Again, very different. Old, young, fat, thin, dark hair, blonde. All right, very different suspects, easily separable. And then there was Michael Wayne, who was actually apprehended and handcuffed at the hotel. There was another man who was also apprehended at the hotel. His name was Terry Lee Frazier. All right, I'm not saying any of these people are guilty. I'm just saying they were apprehended, and they were therefore suspects, at least in the initial hours. So there clearly were other suspects. All right, John Corey was a suspect for a long time. He actually worked at the hotel and hated the Kennedys, was very vocal anti-Kennedy, seemed to have a lot of money, even though there was no visible means of support, got in and out of the country without having any official record of it. Kind of sounded like a CIA agent, if you think about it. And he started to look so guilty, the police kind of tipped him off and said, you know, you're going to need a better alibi. And so then the CIA contacts the LAPD and they have a talk, and suddenly Curry's no longer a suspect. That very same day, they decide he's no longer a suspect. Coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. All right, there was also, and this is a typo on my part, Jesse Greer was actually spelled E-E-R, so apologies for that. But when they had Sirhan and they didn't know who he was and they were trying to find his name, at some point, they thought he was somebody named Jesse Greer because somebody at the hotel told them the shooter's name was Jesse Greer. And that's not Sirhan Sirhan, is it? All right, don't know what happened to Jesse Greer, but in Fernando Flora's excellent book about the girl in the polka dot dress, he talks about a Jesse that he was put on the trail of. And I can't help but wonder if the Jesse he was looking for was Jesse Greer. Okay, and again, this is not a complete list. There were several suspects. So, you know, when the police are telling us this, it's just not true. And it's, how do I want to say it? I don't want you to think, oh, the police, they're all in on it. That's not possible. No, they're not all in on it. But if one of them tells the press something and the press reports it as truth, you know, the others hear it and they go, oh, maybe I was wrong. Maybe that guy, you know, it helps you second guess and it gives you cover and you like, oh, maybe I didn't see what I thought I saw or I didn't hear what I thought I heard. No one wants to believe this stuff. I was talking to a young woman here earlier. There's this lie, this Richard Hofstadter article that's always brought out and quoted and said, people want to believe in conspiracies. They want to believe that somebody bigger than themselves, you know, did this act and that had meaning when in fact it was just a lone assassin. No, that's the direct opposite of what people want to believe. We want to believe people are honest. We want to believe our government can be trusted. We want to believe that things like this don't happen in our country. This is not fun to believe. It is not fun to research. It can be really depressing at times. I tried to make the book fun because it's such a difficult subject. I tried to lighten it up wherever possible. I hope I succeeded. All right, but you know, technically, how do I want to say it? His defense team said in the opening statement at the trial that he was guilty. You know, people think Sirhan had a fair trial. This also is a lie. I mean, they basically admitted his guilt right up front. So really the trial was technically a penalty hearing. So if it was a penalty hearing, why did they bring in witnesses to a girl in a polka dot dress and other topics? It's clear when I read the trial transcript, I got so angry I'd get up and stomp around, you know, before I could sit down and write some more because it was so clear what they were doing. They were setting the trial up as a way to rebut notions of conspiracy in the future and trying to shoot down any of the evidence that they knew had already been made public or had leaked out to the press. And they guaranteed that the trial was designed for that. The trial was not about Sirhan. It was not about protecting Sirhan. It was about ensuring that Sirhan got convicted and that no one thought anybody but Sirhan had done it. And it worked because who's going to sit and read a 5,000-page trial transcript? Hello. I do. I'm geeky that way. I like doing things like that. It took me 3 months, you know, but I did it. And it's very interesting. As I was reading the trial transcript, a few pages were missing. And so I contacted the California State Archives and I'm like, can you find these pages? You know, it's this one and this one and this one. I gave her a whole list and she looked and the, you know, archivist came back. She goes, they're missing from our copy too. And she goes, well, let me check around. So she did, and she managed to find them with the California Supreme Court. And as I suspected, because I kind of could tell where this was going, those were the pages that mentioned hypnosis. And in some cases, you know, a particular prison, Vacaville, where the CIA had done some mind control experiments. Coincidence? I don't think so. Okay. All right, there's another lie, that Sirhan had a good defense team. No, he had a cheat, a drunk, a convicted forger, and a very old mob lawyer who had an alias. This was not your dream team. Absolutely not. In fact, he would have done better with the public defender. I actually was on a jury in Los Angeles and I got to see the public defender at work and she was incredible. It's like this young woman just got up and totally shredded the prosecution's case. It was inspiring. And I thought, man, if I'm never convicted, I want the public defender because they know all the tricks that the police do. Whereas, you know, the rich lawyers from out of town don't necessarily know all that stuff. So he did not get, you know, good representation at all. Plus, his lawyers, for the most part, assumed he probably was guilty. That just never occurred to them he could possibly be innocent under any scenario. And most importantly, his lead attorney was in the middle of his own trial, or in the middle of his own penalty, if you will, because he'd been involved in a trial that involved Johnny Roselli, who the CIA had hired to kill Castro. And so the CIA was a little bit involved in trying to shush that case up, and that's also a part of my book I don't have time to go into. But Cooper was representing a cohort of Roselli in this card cheating scandal case that had come up, and Cooper either had stole himself or was provided a copy of a grand jury transcript, which again goes back to the Mueller story we opened with. All right, that was a totally illegal thing. That's the whole question with Mueller. It's like, because it contains grand jury information, can we release it or not? And in this case, he just had it stolen and had it appear and was using that data. And so that punishment could have been issued as soon as that trial ended, but no. His punishment was held until the end of the Sirhan trial, months later. Can you imagine? So there's literally like a dagger hanging over it. He could have gone to prison. He could have lost his law license. Once Sirhan was convicted and got the death penalty, he got a $1,000 fine, the lowest possible penalty. If you're going to give the guy the lowest possible penalty, why didn't you give it to him 3 months ago? Maybe there was a reason. They wanted to, hold something over him. All right. So the lie, again, that Cooper did the best he could, absolutely not. When the prosecution went to Cooper in chambers with the judge and said, we can't really prove the bullets come from the people we say they come from. He goes, don't worry, I'll stipulate to everything. All right. And the thing was, he had already been warned that Wolfer was not to be trusted. Dwayne Wolfer was an LAPD criminalist who was so corrupt, they actually invented the term Wolferism for a guy who, fakes, misreads the evidence in a case. And that was reported in the LA Times years later. It's like he's a joke at the department. But that's the guy that Cooper chose to believe, even though he'd specifically been warned not to trust Cooper. And in fact, the California State Supreme Court, in a different case, had stopped just a hair short and called his testimony essentially perjurious. I forget the exact words, but it's like they just stopped right short of accusing him of outright perjury, but they went as close as they could without legally having to arrest him, basically. All right, so Cooper did not do a good job for his client. So again, imagine if you're guilty and the prosecution tells your lawyer, hey, we can't prove your client's guilty. And your defense lawyer says, no problem, I'll stipulate to his guilt. Do you want that lawyer? Hell no, hell no. I don't want that lawyer. Sirhan shouldn't have had that lawyer. I would have said mistrial. And that's what happened to Sirhan. He was sunk by a legal team that had no interest in saving his life. No interest, I should say, no interest beyond saving his life. They either assumed he was guilty or felt the need to assure people he was guilty. And their only concern was, trying to save his life, which they didn't. He did get the death penalty, but the death penalty was changed and in California, and so then he got a reprieve. It was reinstated later, but the people who had been in that interim period didn't have to die. All right, here's another lie that came out at the trial. Sirhan was a paranoid schizophrenic. All right, now, I went and I read this. I actually wrote a 149-page chapter on the trial. And then I cut it to about 40 pages because after the stipulation where he basically said, yeah, whatever you want to say, I knew the trial was over right there, even though the rest of it continued for the show. But that's where the trial should have ended. It should have ended in a mistrial right there. But the witnesses, the medical witnesses then looked at his, various psychological tests. They gave him a whole battery of tests. And each one of them was told they were looking at Sirhan's results. Each one of them was told that Sirhan alone had killed Kennedy. So, of course, they're trying to explain how psychotic he was, that, they're not looking at it blind. So years later, Dr. Dan Brown, who's a leading hypnosis expert in the country and, he's testified in all kinds of trials. He really knows his stuff. He gave these same results to people blind. Didn't tell them it was Sirhan, didn't tell them the context, just said sane, insane, what do you see? And they all said, oh, results are in the normal range, 100%, 100%. All right. So again, Sirhan was not given a fair medical exam because everybody knew it was him and they all thought he was guilty, and they're just trying to justify those results against that. That's not how people should be evaluated. All right, yet another lie. Again, that Sirhan fired any bullets at all. There is literally no physical evidence of that. At the trial, Wolfer said that the bullets had come from this gun and no other. He held up a gun in the court and he was adamant about it. And you know what? He might have told the truth, because the gun he put into evidence at the trial did not have the same serial number as Sirhan's gun. And so I'm sure his voice had the ring of truth to the jury because he'd probably personally fired them himself. And he said that in another part of the court transcript, because at first I read that, I'm like, that has to be a typo. But you have to understand, every day the lawyers go through the court transcripts and they corrected the most minute things. I mean, they corrected down to the letter and the spelling of, names and terms. And if that gun number was wrong and didn't match the evidence, they would have corrected it. So that's one. Two, it's not near it on the typewriter, so it's not like a typical mistypo. They don't sound the same. 3 and 8 can't get mixed up. Those were the numbers that were switched. And later in the trial, Wolfer talked about using a gun with a very close serial number to Sirhan's. Sirhan's serial number, H53725. And this other one was H58725. So the last 3 digits were the same, the first 2 were different. And there was a third gun in the case, H18602, not close, not even close. Those are totally different batches. All right, but if you found out that the guy hadn't fired any bullets and you're trying to make sure he gets convicted, and what they do is they'll take the bullets, they'll put it under a microscope, and they'll look at the little minute markings and try and match them up with victim bullets. And if they have the same streak on them in the same place, it was fired from the same gun. So very important to get a gun with a very close serial number, because then it came off the line very close to Sirhan's. So if Sirhan's had a little defect or something might cause a groove in a bullet, maybe the next 2 or 3 guns down the line had a similar groove. So I can see why Wolfer went to great pains to do that. And so we know that it was not the right gun at the trial. There are many records for that. Again, there are more records on that than are in my book, because there were so many I didn't want to, take too much time with that. All right. So what did the police do? They realized it's like, this guy's bullets don't match the victim's bullets. What are we going to do? So they dummy up some bullets. They literally make new bullets. And we know this because the end of a bullet, these were .22 caliber. That's about the size of a pencil, if you can imagine that. On the end of the pencil, the coroner, after he removed the Kennedy neck bullet, inscribed it TN31. All right? You can imagine there's really not room for DW TN31 on that tiny little spot. But when a panel investigated the bullets in 1975, the bullet said only DWTN. There was no 31, and it didn't start with T. And again, we're talking a tiny space. It's not like the coroner would have left room for Wolfer to add his initials later. That's not how it's done. All right, so there's a problem with that one. Another bullet had an X on it when it was turned into evidence. And again, a long chain of doctor records and who marked the X and when, and he handed it to this guy who put it here. Well, the panel gets it has nothing on the base. So they mark it with a 6, Exhibit 6, and not the same bullet. Now, the one that's the closest, there was one that was marked LMO when it was turned into evidence, and the panel could kind of see a faint LM on it on the base. And so they said they matched these 3 bullets together, therefore they had to have come, from the same gun. But I went and looked into the Wiesel bullet because that was the one that really interested me, because the other ones were kind of obviously fake, but this one's like, is it or isn't it? And the more I looked into the record, it was collected on June 5th, but wasn't turned into evidence until late on June 6th, after they had already figured out there was a discrepancy. All right, because as soon as, in Wolfer's log, as soon as the Kennedy neck bullet appears, it's very obvious there's a problem. And then he talks about the fatal bullets, plural, runs and talks to the coroner, comes back, and it's suddenly a fatal bullet, single. It's like there might have been an extra bullet. There's all kinds of weirdnesses that are going on. And I would say read that part of my book, because again, I go like minute by minute through Wolfer's log, and you can kind of see him realizing that he's got a problem. And then there's a gap in the record where it looks like he may have gone out and found that extra gun and dummied up the bullets. And then a photo is made that night that has a bigger lie in it. It's a photo of these 2 bullets, the Kennedy and the Goldstein bullet, but it's not the TN31 and the X bullet. On June 6th, it's a photo of the DWTN and the nothing bullet that show up at the panel later, and they're able to match it to this photo that was dated and taken June 6th. So they knew literally right away and forged the bullets right away. Okay, it's just shocking what has happened. And again, this is not new. I have a friend who was a volunteer for a while in the public defender's office in LA. He goes, oh yeah, we get a handbook of all the tricks that the LAPD does to frame people, and that's in there. It's like they switch the bullets. It's like, this is not new. This was not done just for Sirhan. This is why this history matters. Think of all the people who've been convicted all over the country, all over the planet, because the police have just dummied up the evidence. We have to really understand that there are corrupt people in places that are supposed to be protecting us that don't always, and we can't trust them. And we'd like to, and we should in general, but we should question everything, especially when it's an assassination of such significance. Robert Kennedy was set to be president. You know, he had won the California primary, which is delegate rich. He already, you know, was living, he was a senator in New York, so he had that one in the bag. You only needed a few big states in those days. You know, the delegate counts were differently apportioned. He would have won. So what was Sirhan firing? Because he did fire a gun. If it wasn't bullets, what was it? Well, it sounded like a cap gun. You know, again, these are a few of many witness statements. Robin Kasdan, it sounded like a cap gun to me. Gloria Mulligan thought it might have been a cap pistol. Richard Tuck, sounded like cap pistols or firecrackers. And again, there's like a laundry list of people who said similar things, and some of these are on video too. All right. Ralph Elmore said the gun looked like it was spitting flame. Now, a cap is basically a wad of paper. When you fire it, it flash burns, and that's why you actually see it. And that's why Hollywood loves to use cap guns. It's not just a safety issue. It creates that nice visible flame. It's much less dramatic if you fire a real gun. There's nothing to see. There's no smoke. There's no flame, you know, for the most part. Because, you know, bullets, it's just gunpowder that kind of explodes. But paper literally flash burns, and sometimes there's like a little shower of paper afterwards. And that's what Rafer Johnson, who grew up with these, who was an Olympic decathlon champion, who had seen starter pistols all his life, said it looked like a cap gun throwing off residue. I mean, you can't get a better witness than that. He knows what a cap gun throwing off residue looked like, and that's what he thought he saw. Now, afterwards, here's the thing. Because they're told, well, Sirhan fired, he was the only gunman, so they all assume what I saw must be wrong. And that's kind of the untalked about crime in these cases. Witnesses are made to believe things against what they originally thought. And they're told, you're wrong, that's not what happened. And then they go back to their lives, and there's that like nagging sense. It's like, is that what I saw? Is that not what I saw? And some of the people in later years change their story because they hear so often that it was Sirhan alone. They're like, yeah, it was Sirhan alone. But that's not what Rafer said originally, and we'll come back to that. Okay, now why would Sirhan be firing blanks? I mean, who would volunteer to be a patsy in a conspiracy? If Sirhan knowingly fired blanks, all right, you know, why would you do that? And why would you sit in jail for 50 years and not ultimately divulge your co-conspirators? He's not making any money. He's not rich. You know, he doesn't have any protection. Somebody threatened his life the other day and called his brother in a panic because he has no protection. I mean, he's nothing there. And, you know, he literally can't remember what happened. And again, you can believe him or not, but it is so clear when you listen to the tapes of the first 4 hours, he is not in a normal mental state. There is something going on there. They ask him, you know, what kind of car do you drive? I don't remember. They ask him, are you married? He goes, I don't know. I mean, how do you not know if you're married? You know, it's like, come on. And why would you fake that? Why would you lie about that? You know, he had nothing to hide. Why would you lie about that? All right, so we're talking about him being hypnotized now. All right, what? People can't be hypnotized to do something they wouldn't normally do. You're going to hear that from every hypnotist you ever meet. It's like a mantra for them. And it's not true. It's actually not true. And a lot of modern day hypnosis authorities say that's bullshit. And pardon my language, that's bull crock or whatever. Anyway. The authorities say that's not true. It's true for some people. You know, it depends on whether you're one of these highly hypnotizable individuals. They have a scale of 1 to 5. 1 can't be hypnotized at all. 5 can be made to do just about anything. And Sirhan was like way off the charts 5. I mean, he is so highly hypnotizable. In fact, there was a story, you know, some witnesses saw him in a bar where the bartender was able to hypnotize. It's like anybody could have manipulated this guy. He was that hypnotizable. All right, and here's the thing that people don't really understand is if I, you know, managed to hypnotize some sexy young man and told him to take off his clothes, he might not do it. All right, but if I were able to convince him he was on a tropical beach, he was alone, the sun is beating down, he's so hot, sweat is pouring everywhere, his clothes are getting uncomfortable, in that scenario, he might actually strip in front of me. All right, it's all about shifting the reality of the person. Okay, and so this is what happened at the show that I went to that freaked me out. The lady and her $25,000 check. I went to a lot of hypnosis shows, everyone I could get to for a period of a couple years because I just really wanted to understand how it worked. And I ended up sitting next to a woman before the show started who ended up being a volunteer. And I didn't know she was going to be a volunteer. We'd had this little chat for about 20 minutes, and she was as nice and as normal as any of you that I've talked to in this whole, you know, event so far. Just perfectly normal and nice. And then she gets up on stage, and the hypnotist, does his voodoo and hands her a little piece of Monopoly money and said, here, it's a $25,000 check you won. She's like, oh, I won $25,000. And, just what you'd expect, right? End of show, he unhypnotizes them all. I went and sought out the hypnotist and talked to him about Sirhan. He got uncomfortable and left the area as fast as he could, which I thought was interesting. But then as the crowd is clearing, I saw the woman again, and she was looking really distressed. And so I'm like, what's wrong? I said, did you lose your family? She's like, no, I have to give this back. I said, well, it's just play money. I don't think he cares. And she goes, no, it's a $25,000 check. And again, this is after the show. This is after the hypnotist had left the area. She didn't see me. I saw her. This was not staged for my personal benefit. And I realized, oh my God, she is still in a trance. And you couldn't tell otherwise. Otherwise, she looked entirely like she did before the show. There was no visible sign she was hypnotized, but she was seeing something that wasn't there. And so I mistakenly thought, maybe I can help her out of it. And I'm like, can I hold that with you? And I said, let's bring this closer and look at it. I said, do you see this number here? Do you see that says like 100? And she goes, no, it's a $25,000 check. And I just, my heart broke. And I'm like, wow. And that's when I realized that's what they did to Sirhan. They painted him this other reality. And when he was in the pantry, he was seeing something else. And I didn't know what that something else was at the time. It took a while before I found Dr. Dan Brown's sessions with Sirhan. He spent 60 hours with Sirhan. His original hypnotist, because believe it or not, his defense team did bring in hypnotists who tried to get him to, quote unquote, remember the crime. And basically ended up, how do I want to say, almost trying to implant memories. Sirhan, reach for your gun. Where's your gun, Sirhan? Pull out your gun and fire at Kennedy. Do you remember that? I mean, literally, that was the kind of questions they were asking. Dan Brown didn't do that. Dan Brown's like, what do you see? What do you hear? Where are you? What's going on? Very open-ended questions. And in that, he was able to elicit a scenario where Sirhan met a girl in a polka-dot dress, thought she was really sexy, thought he might get lucky that night, followed her to the bar. She, took him to a coffee urn. He poured him some coffee, took him into the pantry, put him on the tray stand and was kind of holding him there. At some point, something happened. She walked him kind of towards the center of the room where he was ultimately found shooting. She pinched him in a certain way, and suddenly he felt like he was back at the shooting range, and all he saw were like the targets in front of him, and he pulled out his gun and he started firing at targets. And if I hadn't seen that woman in that hypnosis show, I probably wouldn't have believed that. But since I had literally seen how people could be in the grip of an illusion, I totally believed that. It actually fit the scenario perfectly. And again, now think of it from the conspirator's point of view. If you're the conspiracy, and you know you're going to need at least 2 gunmen because, Sirhan's job truly was to be the distractor in a magic act. When you shoot a gun and flame is coming out of it, and the sound of it, all eyes go to you. And that means anybody else can get in and fire guns and no one is looking because they're all looking at that one gun that they saw first. And a lot of witnesses said that, like as soon as they saw the gun, they wouldn't take their eyes off of it. And they wanted to make sure they were safe and that they were out of it. So while Sirhan is firing blanks, somebody in his line of fire is shooting Kennedy. Now, if Sirhan's firing real bullets, what if he kills the security guard before he gets those shots off under the arm? If it was the security guard, maybe he was just hiding somebody near him. But whoever it was, what if he kills the actual killer before he gets the job done? It really actually makes more sense that Sirhan was firing blanks from the conspirator's perspective. Anyway, all right, let's keep going here. All right, I talked about the girl in the polka dot dress, and I talked about why you'd hypnotize somebody. Let's keep going. I wanted to pull, I'm almost done. This Rayford Johnson quote, I want you to remember because I'm going to come back to it in a second. He said, I was concentrating on him, Sirhan, because I saw the gun going like that, so I didn't really look around at that point. If I hadn't seen the gun, I probably would have looked a little more. All right, that's important in the context here. All right, so the police knew they didn't have a case. They knew there were additional suspects. Why weren't they honest about this? Why did they lie and switch the evidence? Well, they were told to on day one by Inspector Powers, and that kind of became the word. And we know this because in the first 90 minutes after the assassination, Sergeant Paul Sharaga broadcast a description of a tall, 6'2", Sirhan, by the way, was about 5'4", and Sirhan had dark curly hair, very slight man, and this is a 6'2" blonde-haired guy in tan clothes, not blue. And Inspector Powers gets on the radio to shut this down emphatically. Powers believed at that point there was only one shooter. Maybe he knew there was more, maybe he didn't. But he basically said, hey, shut that down. We have one shooter. I think I have the quote right here. Here it is. Okay. Where did you get your information on the second suspect wanted on the broadcast? And Sharaga says, well, the second suspect came from a witness who was pushed over by the suspect, witness and his wife. We have the name and address, blah, blah, blah. What proximity to the shooting were these people, Powers asked. Well, they were adjacent to the room. And Powers says, disregard that broadcast. We got Rayford Johnson and Jesse Unruh who were right next to him, and they only have one man and don't want them to get started on a big conspiracy. This could be somebody that was getting out of the way so they wouldn't be shot. But the people that were right next to Kennedy say there was just one man. Now let's look at what Rayford said again. Because I saw the gun, I didn't really look around. If I hadn't seen the gun, I probably would have. That is not the same thing as saying there was only one shooter. He's saying I saw one shooter because I didn't look anywhere else after I saw one shooter. And again, that was what most witnesses do. As soon as any of them saw any gun anywhere, they focused on that gun. And they all thought they were focusing on Sirhan's gun. And in fact, in my research, there were at least 4 guns in the pantry. And you'll have to read my book to find out where they were. All right. I helped Bobby Kennedy Jr. meet Sirhan. I got to meet Bobby Kennedy a couple years ago. And Bobby told Sirhan that he knew he hadn't killed his father. After meeting him, I called him. I said, well, what'd you think? And he said, he's a sweet man. And he felt sorry for him. And so do I. Here's a young Palestinian immigrant, came to America to escape the bombing and the horrors in his own country. He lived in a shack with 40 families that shared one pit for a toilet. I mean, it's just horrific conditions that he escaped to come to America to have a better life. And then he gets framed in this plot and sent to jail for 50 years for a crime he provably didn't commit. Isn't 50 years enough? You've seen the evidence that Sirhan was not the man who killed Kennedy. Again, if you don't believe it, see the book. There's 500 pages of it. You've seen the evidence that Sirhan was likely shooting blanks, a distractor in a magic act. You realize Sirhan has been jailed for 50 years for a crime he didn't commit. We can't bring Bobby Kennedy back. We can't. It's too late. But we can still save a life. And we can save our history with it. And it's what Bobby Kennedy would have wanted. So I set up a petition online. And I hope you'll go there. I'm sorry. It matters. It matters. This guy should not be in jail. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Your